The following message was presented during the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministries 2019 Prophecy Conference season. Now here's Clarence Johnson with a message entitled, God's Parables of the Kingdom.
Well, now that you have your Bibles out, I want you to turn there to Matthew 13 if you haven't done so already. And we're going to be talking about the parables of the kingdom from that chapter. Very, very difficult chapter that we're going to have to work our way through. But I want you to see the context of the parables, and Bruce did a phenomenal job. Didn't he? He did an absolutely phenomenal job with chapters 8 through 12 in setting the context for us. And so it's very important that we have that opportunity to look at these particular parables. The first thing I want you to remember is that coming into chapter 13, we ended chapter 12 with the vile and murderous attack on Jesus by the leaders of Israel, by the religious leaders. It was a vile attack. They claimed that he was doing his miracles by the power of Satan. And Jesus responds with an indictment, not only against the leadership, but he responds with an indictment against the generations and the cities. So in order to understand Matthew 13, which is an immediate following passage, we need to remember what's in Matthew chapter 12. Let me read Matthew chapter 13 and verse 1 through 3 for you today. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. What happened? Jesus leaves that conflict, and he goes out by the Sea of Galilee, and he sits by the sea. And while he's sitting by the sea, great multitudes started to come and press in on him. And people came, and more people came. Why they came, we don't know. Some didn't believe, some believed, some were wondering who he was. Some just wanted to see a miracle. They had heard about him. And as the crowd began to press in, he got into a boat and sat in a boat out in the water as they pressed in along the shoreline. And then he spoke many things to them in parables. Many things to them in parables. We're going to look at these parables, and as we look at them, what we're going to talk about this morning is the definition of the parables, the division of the parables, the purpose of the parables, and the substance of the parables. And as we go through this, I want you to first of all see the definition of a parable. What is a parable? Now, to many of us, it's just simply a story that we read, a story that has a deeper meaning. But the Greek word for parable is parabole. So what we have in the English word parable is just a transliteration from the Greek. And it's two words, parabole. It means to throw, bole, alongside para. And so it's throwing things together in comparison or similitude. So it's throwing things together in order that we might see how they are different or how they are alike. And that's what a parable does. Now, a parable is a very complex form of speech, very complex form of speech. And it is more than just the stories that we see. It can be a metaphor, it can be a proverb, it can be a story, it can be an allegory. And that's what makes it difficult. It's complex to understand the interpretation because it's not just simply the same thing all the time. In fact, the Gospels use the word parable to describe Jesus' teaching or describe other stories and other items of lessons 45 times in the Gospels. So very complicated. But if we were to simplify it, we would just simply say a parable places well-known examples from nature or life alongside an abstract spiritual or ethical truth to express the comparative similarities or differences. So he's going to take examples from life and deep spiritual or ethical truth, and in order to help us understand that deep spiritual and ethical truth, he'll use common things and say, this is like this. And that's the format that we find here in what the parables are. Now, how are the parables divided? It's very interesting as you look down through the passage, and we won't go through to read the many verses in the passage. Trust that you'll go home, read them, study them as you look into the Word deeper and deeper each and every day. But there is a division of the parables. Jesus speaks publicly to the crowd on the shore, and he speaks 4 parables to them. The parable of the sower, the parable of the wheat and tares, the mustard seed, and leaven. Now, Jesus also, and it tells us in the passage, he also leaves that crowd, goes into a house, and meets with his disciples privately. And as he meets with his disciples privately, he speaks 4 more parables. The parable of the treasure, the parable of the pearl, the parable of the dragnet, and the parable of the householder. Now, I see 8 parables in this particular passage in Matthew chapter 13, but there are many scholars and many men that I admire and many men that I read, and some of them were my teachers. They believe that there's only 7 parables, and they discount the last parable of the householder. But I believe that it should be included as a parable along with many others. There's not only a division, though, of the public and the private. As I look at the passage, I want you to see that there is also a division of the topic and of the thrust or the theme of the parables. What we have here as we look at the way that this whole passage develops and Jesus' whole teaching develops is we have this division that I have on the screen for you. The first parable is an introductory parable, the parable of the sower. The last parable, the parable of a householder, is a summary parable. The 6 parables in between are parables that are giving us the truth about the kingdom of heaven. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you're to look closer at all of this, what you'll find is that the first parable, the parable of the sower, does not use the format, the kingdom of heaven is like. And the last parable does not start with the format, the linguistic format, the kingdom of heaven is like. Although it uses that phrase in there, that's not the subject of the parable. But the 6 parables in between all begin and all use as a comparison, the kingdom of heaven is like. Or this is like the kingdom of heaven. And so the middle 6 parables, the remaining 3 that are to the public crowd, I call the opposition parables, because they are speaking and giving truth about the opposition to the truth, to the message of the kingdom, to the Messiah, to the kingdom that he's going to bring. The treasure and the pearl parables are parables that talk about the preciousness of the kingdom, and they're given in private. The dragnet parable is a parable that talks about the adjudication or the judgment that's promised for the kingdom. So as we look at this, what we find is there's not only a division of what's public and what's private, but there's also a division of the theme. And that first parable, the sower, is very, very important, because if you go over into Mark, what you find is we're told there that Jesus tells his disciples, if you don't understand, if you can't understand the first parable, you won't understand the rest of the parables. So what we see is the first parable is a key to understanding the rest of the parables. That's why Jesus said, if you're having trouble understanding this, man, you're not going to understand the rest of them, because they were confused about what all this meant and why Jesus was teaching in parables. So dividing them up, that helps us to put these things into place. Now, what's the purpose of these parables? Why did Jesus start to teach in parables? In verse 3, it says, "Then he spoke many things to them in parables." And in verse 10 of chapter 13, "And the disciples came and said to him, 'Why do you speak to them in parables?'" Why do you speak to them in parables? Well, Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 13, beginning with verse 10 and on through verse 17, he tells us that there's two reasons why he's using parables. Number one, he's using parables to reveal truth to a certain group, and he's using parables to conceal truth to another group. If you take a look at that passage, let me read a few of those verses, beginning with verse 11. "He answered and said to them, 'Because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given.'" Who's the them? Who's the you? That's important. "For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, 'Hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull.'" And it goes on. In verse 16 it says, "But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you, that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it." So what's he saying? He's actually saying, I'm using parables to some as a judgment. And Bruce talked about that in Romans chapter 11. And Jesus mentions that when he quotes from Isaiah, because that was a judgment upon the Israelis and the Jewish people at that time for their disobedience, for their rejection of the truth. So he used parables in judgment on some, those who did not believe and those who would not receive, those whose hearts were hardened against him as the king and the message of the kingdom that he was proclaiming. To them, they couldn't understand. They heard it, but they couldn't understand. But to the disciples, the you in this passage, to the disciples and to those who believed on him, to those who put their faith in the king and the kingdom that was being offered, believing that this was the provision of God, that he was the one that God had sent, then it tells us that they were blessed. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Because what Jesus was teaching in the parables, the prophets in the past wanted to see, but it was not revealed yet. Because what he was teaching in the parables is something new. It's something new. That's what verse 17 gives us an indication of. "I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see it, and what you see and hear, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it, because it wasn't revealed to them." So when we think of parables, we have to understand that, oh, how nice they look, but we need to remember, for some, it's a pronouncement of judgment. Not the content, but the very use of parables. And for others, it's a blessing, and it reveals truth. Well, what's the substance of these parables? What do they contain, and what is Jesus talking about? Well, it contains three things, and I think it's important, and we'll break this down for you as we look at the passage and look at the way it develops. The first of all, Jesus tells us that these parables, in verse 11, it says, when they ask about him speaking in parables, he said, "It has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven." The mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. So we know that the parables contain what Jesus calls mysteries. Oh, it's kind of interesting. What's a mystery? And they're mysteries that belong to the kingdom of heaven. And part of the mysteries that are revealed as we go through the passage gives us a timeline that is associated with the kingdom of heaven. How does all this work? Well, first of all, to understand what a mystery is, we need to look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 26. Because a mystery is that which has been hidden from ages and from generations, but now has been revealed. So it's not something that's spooky. It's not something that's, you can't figure out. It's not something that has a whodunit type of a thing. It's not Agatha Christie's 10 Little Indians, who did the murder. A mystery is divinely revealed truth about the kingdom here in this passage, the kingdom of heaven, that was not revealed in the Old Testament or in Jesus' earlier ministry. A mystery is divinely revealed truth about the kingdom of heaven that was not revealed in the Old Testament or in Jesus' earlier ministry. So this is new truth about the kingdom of heaven that they didn't know about. They didn't understand it. As we consider this, how does this all work together? See the larger circle there where it says the kingdom of heaven? The parables are about the kingdom of heaven. That's the larger circle. Included in the truth of the kingdom of heaven, all the vast truth, the Old Testament truth, the teaching of Jesus, the proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom, there is a group of truth that has not been revealed until Jesus speaks it in parables in Matthew 13. And they are the mysteries. And the mysteries are part of the overall truth of the kingdom of heaven. It is not the mystery kingdom. It is not the mystery form of the kingdom. These are previously unrevealed truths that are now being revealed about the kingdom of heaven, the same kingdom that John the Baptist taught, the same kingdom that Jesus spoke about, the same kingdom that he sent his disciples out to proclaim. It's an earthly kingdom, it's a Jewish kingdom, and Jesus is the king. And it's promised in the Old Testament, and it's expected by the Jewish people. Now, part of this mystery that's being revealed also helps us to understand the timeline. The timeline. To give us a general idea of what we're talking about here is in the Old Testament, the Jewish people expected that the Messiah was going to come. He was going to come to conquer the world. He was going to judge the world, and he was going to establish his glorious kingdom as King of Israel over the world. That's their understanding. Their understanding was one Advent. One Advent. Two Advents are not revealed in the Old Testament. They only saw one Advent. Now, there's some hints that as we go back and try to read the New Testament into the Old Testament, but we can't do that. You have to take it in a proper hermeneutic. And so what we see here is this is new because the timeline is going to deal with what's going to be the character of the days or years or age between the rejection of the Messiah in Matthew 12 and the coming of the Messiah in a second advent to rule and to reign. So what we have here in Matthew 13, the parables cover the period of time between the rejection of Jesus as the Messiah and the rejection of the kingdom in Matthew 12, all the way up to his second coming to establish the kingdom. And that includes a number of things. It is not the church age. It is not the church. Now, the church exists during part of that time, but not during the whole time. In fact, it covers the end of Jesus' earthly ministry here on earth. Because even as Bruce was saying, this is a major point of transition Things are changed here between chapter 12 and 13 going forward. A change in the way the gospel is proclaimed, a change in the ministry that Jesus does, a change in who is now reached out to, and so on. It goes up to the time of Pentecost, and then it covers also the time of the existence of the church on earth, when God's working through the church here on earth, up to the rapture. And then it continues on past the rapture, up to the tribulation period, the 7 years of judgment on Israel and judgment on the world, and it continues all the way until Jesus gloriously returns as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, to establish his kingdom. So what we have in Matthew 13 is a new definition, a new character study, if we want to put it that way, of the inter-advent period, meaning the period of time between his first coming and the rejection of the king and his second coming as the glorious king. So we have to be careful. It's not a mystery kingdom. The mysteries are about the kingdom, and it is not the church. It involves too much time. So the general characteristics. Let's take a look at the parables. I wish we had a whole conference on Matthew chapter 13. Wish we had 1 or 2 sessions on each of the parables, because what you'll find is the way that different people look at the parables usually comes from their preconceived ideas in whatever theological group you're in. In fact, those who have similar foundational basis in theology that we would have, that the Friends of Israel had, that most of you would have with us here today, even in that midst, there are so many different views and so many different opinions about the parables, and a lot of it comes from our preconceived ideas and traditions within our theological group. And then when you move into other theological groups, you find all kind of allegorization, you find all kind of spiritualization, and there's a lot of difficulties with this, because what happens is, on the one hand, you have people that allegorize or spiritualize these parables to the point where they're not recognizable, and everything has a meaning and a spiritual meaning, and that doesn't really mean that, and we just, and they have 100 different meanings for it. And on the other hand, there are those who just generalize them so much that they make it fit anything. Yeah, I see this. This is my Sunday school class. This parable, we have to be careful, because a lot of false truth is taught in the way these parables are looked at. I respect many of these men. And so even though what you may find, and we aren't going to go in depth in the parables, but I may have a different opinion. What I have done is, as I look at the scripture and the text, I'm sticking solely to the text, and not trying to inculcate my dispensational view, not trying to inculcate that hermeneutic, not trying to inculcate the fact that I was, brought up and cut my theological teeth in the school that C.I. Scofield founded. I'm not going to do that. I want to look at the text. So as we look at the first parable, the parable of the sower, this is one of the parables that Jesus explains. So the meaning is very, very clear. Very clear. And as we look at the parable of the sower in verse 18, it says, "Therefore hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches it away." And he goes on to talk about the fact that that's the seed by the wayside. You're familiar with the parable. What it's talking about is sowing seed and the types of ground that it falls on. And Jesus explains that what this simply means is that the ground is representative of the hearts and the willingness or receptivity of a person's heart and attitude to the word of the kingdom, to the word, to the proclamation of the word of the truth. And so very simply, that's what the parable of the sower is. And remember, I said it's introductory, and in order to understand the following parables, we need to understand that principle, that the faith in, belief in, acceptance of the word and the message and the Messiah and the King and the kingdom is dependent on the heart. And this is the same it's been with the Word of God from time past with the prophets, during Jesus' day, during the apostles' day, even today and into the future. It's a matter of their heart and their willingness to receive and believe. And what happens is the one who receives the seed, in verse 23, on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. What he's saying is those who receive the word and truth with the right heart, with the right attitude, are going to bear fruit. They all understood this. It was an agricultural culture. The second parable is the parable of the wheat and tares. And if you notice here in verse 24, the way this one starts out, it says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. And then what happened is, as the crop came up, you can't tell the difference when they're young plants between wheat and tares. And if you try to pull them out, you might pull out the good things and you're going to ruin the crop. And so you've got this problem. But Jesus explains this parable as well. He gives an explanation in verse 34. In 34 to 43. And it goes on to say that as he met with them and he did this, the parable that he is sharing with them, he's telling them what? He's telling them that this parable of the wheat and the tares is the fact that he's going to sow sons of the kingdom throughout the world. The field is the world. And they're believers. They're those who have received the word. They're those who are going to grow and produce fruit. But the enemy, Satan, he's going to come along and plant false, fake, counterfeit sons alongside to confuse the world. Now I want you to notice here, there's a change here, that he's sowing these in the world. Up to this point, Jesus told them, and the gospel of the kingdom was only to go to the Jews, only to go to Israel. But now we're talking about the world. And so what happens is, they have to wait until the crop has grown up, and then when that crop grows up, then God will send judgment, and they will pull up the tares, and they will be burned in the fire. But the wheat is going to be gathered into what? Into the barn. And that barn is the kingdom. And so what he's saying is the characteristic of this inter-Advent period is going to be that the sons of the kingdom, that believers are going to be in the world alongside the sons of the wicked one. And at times it'll be difficult to tell, but when the end comes, that judgment is going to come. And the good will go to the barn, the millennial kingdom, and the tares will go to eternal fire and judgment. The parables of the mustard seed and the leaven. This is a tough one. These two are tough because the big issue that's going on here is the issue, is this talking about the expansion of good, or is this talking about the expansion of evil? Well, many commentators say that it's the expansion of good. The leaven in the bread, it swells and so on. This is talking about the church expanding throughout the world, and the mustard seed grows in this great giant, bush, and it's encompassing everything and so on. However, there's a little bit of a problem with that I have, and I find that it's untenable to think of that, because prophetic truth tells us what? That the world is not going to get better and better, and good is not going to overcome evil in this world, that evil overcomes good until what? Till Jesus comes back. and rescues this world. Now, a mustard seed, you have to understand, just tiny is one of the smallest seeds. Well, mustard seed grows, and in fact, you see that picture there, that's a mustard seed plant, and has the little pods on it with the seeds in it. In Israel, they can grow to be over 10 feet tall, these plants. They're short-lived. They rise up, they die. They're annuals. Any of you gardeners and plant flowers, you know what an annual is. It only lasts for one season. They have a short life. And the only way that the mustard seed can, spread or propagate is if it drops its seeds. If it drops its seeds. And in fact, if left alone, without any interference, mustard plant will become pervasive and invasive and take over an area. So what I see this as is the word of the kingdom is that seed, matching what we find in the key parable, the sower, is the seed that disseminates itself, and if left alone, it would become pervasive. But you see, the enemy sends birds, just like we saw in the first parable, sends birds, and they roost waiting for these seed pods to open and eat the seeds. In fact, if you do some study today, what you'll find is that even today they use mustard seed and bird seed to attract the wild birds. And birds somehow sense that they know when these seed pods are going to dry and burst open, and they're ready to eat the seeds. And so what we see is that the word of the kingdom, the good news about the kingdom and about God's provision in Jesus the Messiah is going to be disseminated even in some small ways, but that the enemy is going to provide hindrances that will devour and hinder that seed from spreading and becoming pervasive. Oh, there will be other mustard seed plants, but they won't take over. In the same way, the leaven. In fact, when Jesus talks about leaven, every other place he uses leaven in terms of evil. Jesus never uses leaven in any other place in terms of good. So I have a problem with trying to make leaven good here. And what happens with leaven is, it'll sour the dough. It ferments it. And if you let it go, it will continue to sour and sour it. And you have to apply something to stop it. And what do you do to stop it? You put it in the oven and you bake it, and heat stops the action of the yeast. Now, what does the dough come from? Dough comes from wheat. And what is the product, the fruitfulness of those who receive the word with good hearts? They produce manyfold, don't they? They produce wheat. And so as we put this all together in this kind of format, what I see here is the fact that the fruitfulness of believers during this period, the fruitfulness of those who've received the word and followed the Lord and are bearing fruit, that fruitfulness is hindered in portion because in the parable, only a portion of the flour is infected with the yeast. A portion of the fruitfulness is hindered and spoiled by the infusion of evil and false teaching. The parables of the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price. Now we make a shift. We are now shifting inside with the disciples. And we're also shifting in theme. The first three parables that were given to the crowd after the introduction talked about the opposition and the interference with the spread of the good news, the spread of the gospel, the spread of God's kingdom work in preparation for the kingdom. In this section, these two parables, it talks about the preciousness. Why is this important? It's important because the disciples are all excited about Jesus being the Messiah. They're following him. And their expectation is, look at the crowds. Everybody's going to follow him. Jesus has this confrontation with the religious leaders, and there's all of this persecution and so on, and the crowd's against them. And all of a sudden they go, what's going to happen here? They see that there's a rejection of the kingdom in chapter 12. They're there, and they see Jesus' indictment against them. What's going to happen to the kingdom? Is it over? Is it going to come? What's going to happen to Jesus? What's going to happen to our message? This is what we've been doing. And they don't want it. Well, Jesus teaches them in private with two parables, a parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price. And what he's teaching them is the preciousness of the kingdom. Don't give up. The kingdom is still viable. The kingdom is still alive. The kingdom is not defeated. The king is not defeated. Now, many look at these two parables and they say, oh, this parable talks about Christ dying on the cross, rising again, to purchase Israel, the treasure, and to purchase the pearl of great price, which is the church. The term pearl is used in the New Testament 9 times. It's always used in the sense of a precious jewel. And when it's used that way, rather interesting, when it's symbolic of a group of people, it's only used once symbolically as a group of people. And that's in Revelation 21, when it's the pearly, what we call the pearly gates in the New Jerusalem, and that refers to the 12 tribes of Israel. So I have a problem if we make the pearl the church. And in fact, some of the commentators who have the integrity to say, I have no biblical basis to say it's the pearl, but it fits. No biblical basis to say that the church is the pearl, but it fits my theology. But it doesn't fit the text. What Jesus is teaching is that the kingdom is so important and so precious that you should do everything in your power to pursue it. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and its righteousness. He goes on to make a promise that said, those who give up houses and family and so on and so forth, those who give that up for the sake of the kingdom, they're going to get the kingdom and they're going to be rewarded 100-fold. It's the same with treasure. Jesus uses treasure 13 times in his messages, where treasure is treasure. Treasure is treasure. It's used 34 times in the Bible, and on 4 occasions it refers to Israel, but that doesn't mean every time it's referring to Israel. And besides, when did Jesus stumble on Israel in a field? Israel was chosen before the foundation of the world, and so was the church. Jesus didn't go around and say, oh, that's a nice group of people. I like that pearl. Oh, wait a minute, here's a better pearl. Oh, wait, this is the best pearl. I'll call that the church. He didn't do that. We were chosen before the foundation of the world. And so he's telling them, it's precious. Don't give up on it. Don't lose hope. Don't give up. It's precious. It's precious. The parable of the dragnet. And I appreciate your patience. The parable of the dragnet. What's this talking about? This is talking about judgment in this inter-Advent period. Now, what do you mean, judgment? You see, when the Messiah was going to come, he was going to come, the Jewish understanding, he's going to come and he's going to what? He's going to judge the world. And he's going to get those people. That's the Jewish understanding. And so the question comes, because parables always answer a question, the question comes, well, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen with all this evil and with all this other? And Jesus gives a parable that the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet. Now, a dragnet is not like the fishing net you throw over the side. A dragnet is where the entire area is encompassed by a net, and they pull it tighter and tighter and tighter and closer, and it brings in everything that was within the scope of that dragnet. Everything. And what he's saying, it's like a dragnet. And the angels, what they're going to do is they're going to pull this net in at the end of this inter-advent period. And they're going to separate the fish, some to blessing and some to judgment. And everyone on earth, everyone within that dragnet will be judged either for blessing or for judgment. What's Jesus saying? Don't give up. The judgment's still coming. It's just been delayed. Well, there is so much more to tell you, but I'm going to summarize quickly the last parable. The last parable is not a part of the kingdom parables. It's a parable that's a summary that challenges the disciples. It said it's like a householder who goes into his treasure room, and here again, in the same teaching of parables, treasure is treasure. Goes into his treasure room, and he brings out old things and he brings out new things. And what Jesus tells the disciples is, the old promises about the kingdom, the old covenants have not been nullified. We're not throwing them away, regardless of the rejection of the Jews. But the new truth that you've been given is added into that, in addition to that. So he tells them, like a scribe who is supposed to, scribe the word and pass on the word, he's saying, now you pass on both the old and the new together. He's saying, take what you've learned. Don't give up and abandon the old, the promises, because they're still in effect, but add to it the new truth that I'm giving you. Well, a lot here, isn't there? Basically, what's he saying? Jesus, in this portion of Scripture, is saying there's a period between my two advents when the word is going to go out, and there are still people who are going to believe, and they're going to believe all through this age, but it's going to be across the world. No longer am I giving my message to one group of people and keeping them separate so that they can be insulated from the world. It's going across the world, side by side with evil. And it's going to continue that way, and there's going to be opposition. But don't give up hope, because the kingdom is precious. Don't give up hope for the blessings that are yet to come, for the promises that are yet to be fulfilled, and the judgment that will still take place. Go out and disseminate that message. Amen?